Sunday Talks with the Marshmallow Man.
Hey, I'm Ossie from Three Monkeys Solderless, home of the world's best cables for your pedal board, for your DC, for your audio, for both. So check us out at threemonkeyssolderless.com. So it's Sunday, and I think we're just going to continue on with the Don Landee thoughts and the Don Landee development and the thoughts about that. So if you haven't known, and if you're here, you obviously know that Don Landee made an appearance in Tape Op magazine, courtesy of Greg Renoff. And it was a pretty interesting interview, as it gave a little bit of more insight into, how Don Landee's mind works, which is pretty creative, I think, and has a long experience in a lot of diverse areas to pull from in his experiences of being a musician, of recording things, his father being an electrical engineer, him being an engineer, working in radio, working in studios, on so many different albums with so many different people. So I figured we'd just go right back into it again and kind of talk about, what might be going on with all these albums and things. And in the context, we've sort of been chasing the 1984 tone recently. And I think that I had to basically, once again, open up my own bottle of medicine and take a whole bunch of it and read from my own book and come to the conclusion again that even if you have like the amplifier and you have all that kind of right, there are still phenomenon that you can't account for unless you're in the same place and time as the original recordings were done in. And that has a lot to do with things like derivative sounds, resonances, things like that. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that, because obviously these guys were pretty heavy experimenters in terms of resonance and derivative sounds. And what I mean by that is you can have a sound that you can generate in a room from an instrument or from, whatever, a voice, an instrument, let's say an instrument, and that will create a certain, let's say, fingerprint of sound, a frequency, a relativeness between the different frequencies, how it goes in terms of peak and duration, what the waveform looks like, all those things. Now that sound wave, right, has the ability now to travel away from the instrument and interact with its environment. So the environment is everything. So we have things like walls, we have other instruments, we have different materials, glass and metal and foam and concrete. We have even the instrument itself can act as a resonant, right? A derivative resonance to the strings resonance, right? That's why guitars sound different. Is you will have, a pitch that's created by a string, right? Just a pitch. And this metal is creating just a frequency of energy let's put it that way. It's creating energy at a particular wavelength. And that energy is entering this piece of wood and covered in whatever, plastic lacquers, all that kind of stuff. And then the body is absorbing that energy and resonating it in accordance with its construction. The room is resonating with that energy. That energy is then bouncing off the walls and coming back to the string and modifying how the string is now working. It can reinforce it, or it could cancel it. It could reinforce certain parts of the frequency bandwidth. It could cancel certain parts of the frequency bandwidth. So the idea of a derivative sound would be trying to use the secondary characteristics of the reaction of outside objects to create sounds relative to the original input signal that will complement it. And I think these guys were not opposed to doing anything, right? So I think the first thing that'd be interesting to talk about, would be in the article, he talked about Sunday Afternoon in the Park, right? Which was on Fair Warning. And it was sort of like this keyboard part that Ed had done with this really El Cheapo Electro Harmonix, sort of like plasticky, touchpaddy, like an early form of like an Apple computer or an Atari computer touchpad where it's really janky. And apparently this particular item was resonating with Alex's kick drum. So they were in the studio, Ed and Al, I guess, and Mike too, and they were playing this piece and they're recording it. And Ed must have had the keyboard set up close to Al's kick, and the cheesiness of this keyboard, it was getting affected by the kick drum. So let's I've got that on the track here, and I don't have it queued up because I'm an idiot. So what we're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to bear with me, and we're going to find the spot that we're talking about so you can hear what I'm saying. We're getting close to it anyway. Right here, I guess. No, it wasn't there. Let's see where we're here. So when Al is hitting the kick drum, it's influencing that keyboard. So on the kick, boom, 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 it's changing the way that keyboard sounded, right? So if you're trying to exactly duplicate that, you're going to need that kick drum in there. So there's an idea that, was serendipitous, right? They were, like we talked about before, the mother of invention is observation. If you're a keen observer of your surroundings, you can spot things that are happening around you that you could then apply to another sort of venture, right? So you're like, oh my God, that thing's starting to trigger the keyboard. Well, let's use that as the trigger for the keyboard, or maybe we'll use it as an enhancement factor. Now, getting back to, let's say, like something like 1984, if we go back to, let me mute the Sunday Afternoon in the Park. If we go back to Panama again and listen to that, we might have a better understanding why what I'm doing is chasing my tail. So that's what I meant by taking my own medicine. Is that unless I have the room that Eddie was recording in and some of the other things in there and understand what they were using in the derivatives of the original amplifier sound, I'm never going to get there. I'm going to have the bass sound really close, but I'm not going to get this interesting sort of sound. So let's listen to this again. Had the mic muted there. Now, again, I do believe that this signal is made up of multiple sounds, and the direct sound as well as the room sound. Now, the room sound could be combined of many different microphones in different places. It could also be the result of, let's say, creative engineering. So I remember in my own experience, some 30 years ago, maybe even longer than that, actually. No, it was right around 30 years ago. Rehearsing in a studio along with, a band. And this was just a basic rehearsal studio. But the drum kits, it was fairly small. The drum kit was right next to me. And I used to like to come in early and play a little bit. And one thing that I noticed is that my guitar was really exciting the cymbals in the drum kit. And after I'd hit a chord, I'd hear it in the cymbals. So then I started to listen to the cymbals really closely playing it. And I was like, that sounds really cool. So that got me on a whole thing where I ran down to, Guitar Center and started yelling at cymbals. I'm in the Guitar Center and I'm like looking at cymbals and I'm going like, ah! And then listening to it. And a guy who was in the drum room came over and he's like, I don't know what the hell he was thinking, but he's like, so you're interested in symbols or something like that? And I'm like, well, kind of. I explained to him what I was trying to get to, and he was like, all right, I get you. So then I just started screaming at symbols in this place for a while, trying to find the one that was really the most active that I could hear. And I came up with this weird one that was like a hand hammered one. And it was made at the time, it was called like a Wuhan gong, was what the name of the actual piece was. So I bought it and I took it home and I started to basically try to make a reverb unit out of this cymbal. So it came with like, all right, let's apply some of this EMT sort of like theory and technology to the cymbal, right? So an EMT is basically like a steel sheet that's very thin and it's suspended in like a frame by springs. And the springs are tensioned. And if you were to hit it, it would sound like thunder, like, right? And what they did was they put what's called a transducer on the sheet of metal itself and an exciter. So it's similar to like what you would have in a reverb tank. A reverb tank where one end of the spring is sort of exciting the spring, right? With a transformer, with just basically moving it around like a coil would when you put energy through it, and the other side is reading it, and the waves travel through the spring back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, smash into each other, elongate, that kind of thing, and that's what creates the reverberated sound. So I was figuring out where to put these things on the cymbal and how I could excite this big piece of, brass, I think it was, and be able to get a good sound out the other side. This is before the internet, the internet was around, but it wasn't really, anything that was useful other than, basically, poop slinging on message boards. There wasn't a lot of material. Libraries hadn't been put on yet on the internet. There wasn't resources of the patent libraries on there, what have you. So I had to spend a lot of time in patent libraries in my life looking at microfiche and stuff like that, trying to find out what these things are and how they work. But suffice it to say, eventually I sort of put it aside. I knew it was a valid theory, but I figured, you know what, this is taking up too much time, and it's, is there really any reason to do it, or am I just following, some kind of nutty idea as usual? So my life has been just strewn with nutty ideas that, come to a certain point, and then, I figure, well, maybe there's not really a great demand for something like this, so I sort of put it to the side. So getting back to the point, there's also, like times where I've heard people were, in the studio and in the control room, they noticed that, the steel door on the supply closet was resonating with the monitors in such a way that they thought sounded really good. So they put a microphone on the steel door inside the control room while they were doing playback and recorded that and combined it with the signal. So this idea that, I'm going to be able to recreate that exact sort of phenomenon that's in 1984's guitar sound through, just a couple of things it's not realistic. It really isn't. You could spend the rest of your life doing it and may not get it. So, I mean, if we look at what Don was doing with Ed in the studio around that time, they were doing things like putting microphones and speakers in their septic tank of the house. I remember reading that somewhere else too, that they would drop a microphone down in the septic tank, and I think a speaker too down in there, and I guess to get a really shitty sound. Wah, wah. And they would listen to the reverb inside the septic tank. So are we listening? Is that what the Panama guitar sound is? Is there septic tank reverb in there? It's possible. Could it be, they were miking the drum kit? Well, they were, right? If you're playing live in a room and you have a drummer and a guitar player, those drums are being mic'd, close mic'd, right? Then the cymbals are too. And even when, Al's not playing the cymbals, those cymbals are still being recorded. And if the amplifier is in the room, they're going to resonate with the guitar amp, right? So there's a chance that, all these microphones were put in some unusual places in very creative ways to come up with this sound. So, I mean, let's say here's if we could do this, I don't know. Let me just show you something that's sort of interesting too. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen it, but it's a good way of demonstrating, I think, resonance. So I turned back on the amplifier and I got the guitar here. And what I'm going to do is basically, all right, so let me put this up where you can see what I'm doing here. So I have the guitar and I'm going to mute every string but the low E string. I'm going to open up the volume, right? So you can hear the low E, right? And what I'm going to do is just pick this. Right? So what you're hearing is the effect, get it to quiet down, the effect of this resonant energy, right? You can even hear my voice now exciting this string, right? So everything in this room this is a derivative sound of my voice. If I talk at the string, right, you could hear how it's sort of, that's all I'm doing is talking at it, or I could yell at it, wah! And it's getting a sound or an energy based upon my voice. Now, it's not the same as picking, right? This has some different frequencies in it than if I talk at it. There's more harmonics, more higher end, because it has to do with the energy that's put into the string is only going to be at the frequencies that it's introduced. So this, right, is only going to produce energy or transfer energy to the string in those frequencies that are contained in the original source. So the derivative is always, it's related to very strongly the source material. So, I mean, Jimmy Page used to do things like, I've heard that he would have one guitar sitting up against the amplifier while he was playing another guitar. And this guitar would also be plugged in, but in a way that it wouldn't, go into ultra feedback, but it would resonate with the cabinet and offer some analog, some derivative sounds to the original source material of what Jimmy was playing on one of these, Strats or Les Pauls or Dan Electros or whatever. So that was something that was, done. And, this could be anything. We could have mics on glass. We could have mics up in corners of rooms, on cymbals, in septic tanks, in closets with pipes wrapped around them. It's endless. So to really kind of get the album sound on this, I think is going to be very difficult. I mean, I think, as close as we got is about, so there's some similarities and then some differences. But in the end, I think the project to get that exact sound is not possible. Van Halen 1 stuff seemed to be a little bit easier to get to, because it seemed like the recording process wasn't as bizarre as this album was. I think some of these albums are easier to get to than others due to the fact that the recording process was not as eccentric as this particular 1984 album was. I think this is what happens when you get Eddie and Don together and totally unsupervised. You know, these guys need supervision in order to maintain decorum. If you put them together in a room, there's going to be trouble. It's a bad idea. They're going to be running around 5150 hiding tapes from Ted Templeman. The record company's going to send over security guards to try to arrest them. It's going to be a disaster. So yeah, so that's sort of where we're at. That doesn't mean I'm not going to stop messing with the sound. It just means to get really stupid close on this album is going to be difficult. Some of the other albums I think we're going to get closer to. But this one, it's still an enigma. I'm still thinking about like what possibly could have the resonant frequencies of that I'm hearing on his guitar. I'm starting to think it's the room. I think more than likely that what we're hearing is that room. There were areas in that room that had that kind of slightly metallic but slightly nasal sound to it. So there we have that. So anyway, I thought that we would go and listen to, or rather look at some of these comments. So I didn't do that. I haven't done that for a while. So we go not too far back, but we just start, going over these and see if there's any meat on the potatoes. Meat with the potatoes, or whatever the hell I'm saying. I have no idea. All right, so let's start off with a couple days ago. So we'll go to, these go to 11. I've been in and out and wanted to ask what happened to the possibility of the Marshall 12301 being used by Page for that one track. Okay, Plexi Dust. Where are we at with that? So that sort of that timeline, that storyline was introduced to me by Plexi Dust, as we know. So I'm waiting on information too. I can't wait to hear more about it. So Plexi, if you're out there, I know you're hearing this. Let me know where we're at with the Page Plexi, with the Rose Palace Plexi Page Eddie sort of like triangle here. All right. So next question. Let's see. I'm just trying to look for stuff that has like that I can an answer. All right. So them Fuzzy Monsters. Hey, Fuzzy, good to see you back again. So in my honest opinion, 1984 is mostly PAFs. After several years of hot pickups, Ed went back to PAFs until 1985, 5150 and Live Without a Net in 1986. The custom did not exist until 89 or 90 was the first attempt at recreating the tone of the Brunken 5150 guitar pickup. Eventually, DiMarzio superseded, and the pickup is an E-beam or an Ernie Ball Music Man access to the state. Custom isn't bad tonally, but it excites the amp too much for this 1940. Well, Fuzz, I agree that there was definitely PAFs involved in this, because obviously he used the, or at least he said he used the Flying V. And that Hot for Teacher clean sound definitely sounds like a neck humbucker. Could be wrong, because a lot of Les Pauls turned out to be Telecasters in the Led Zeppelin world. All right, so the custom did not exist until 89 or 1990. Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I've got this right. I was under the impression that the custom was a custom with an Alnico magnet in it. So maybe it didn't exist as an offering from Seymour Duncan, so to speak, but I can't imagine that they didn't produce that pickup with an Alnico magnet in it for somebody. Recreating the tone of the broken guitar pickup. Maybe, I don't know. But the custom predates 5150 by a ways. So maybe you can elaborate on that, because that doesn't seem to add up to me. But I'm not saying that if it doesn't add up to me, it's wrong. That would not be the case. All right. Let's see. Is there being anyone else would have no way? Good comments from Chandler. Thank you, Chandler. And from Scott. Thanks, Scott. Comments from the interview. All right. Arlen Stephenson. Let's see. What do you think about the comments from the interview? He always used just one main Marshall amp in the studio. There was seldom anything more than that. And just one cabinet. Yeah, always. He recorded with Ed with Shure mics. If the mic was right on the speaker, it was likely a 56 or 57. Does this squash the theory of slaving in the studio? The comment about the quietest Marshall is also baffling. How does one achieve the level of distortion and sustain otherwise? If it was largely achieved with the Variac, why can't we all replicate it? Confused more than ever. You're going to have to go back, Arlen. And, okay, It does discount the idea of slaving. It does discount that if it was just one amp and one cabinet. But the quietest Marshall he's ever heard, I think I've addressed it, and this amp does that. So if you were to plug this amplifier, which is a 100-watt Marshall, right, 4 EL34s, which has an internal variac but is loaded in a very particular way, and you plug it into a 412 cabinet, you can pretty much talk in the room and you'll be able to hear yourself. It'd be louder than you would probably want to hear. Let's say if you're in, just in an apartment by yourself and you don't want your neighbors screaming at you. But it's certainly not louder than, let's say, a loud TV. That's about it. But it is certainly not as loud as a 100-watt full-bore plexi. Now, even if you were to take a stock 100-watt plexi and lower the voltage down to 80 volts, that's still going to put out more wattage than you need to make your ears bleed. There's absolutely no question about that. We could do the physics of it. We can look at, the speaker efficiencies of Celestion speakers, and we could determine the decibel levels that will be created through the wattage that we know is being created by the amplifier, given the plate voltage and the tube types, right? So the variac is not what's doing it. It's part of sort of the sound of the amplifier, but it's not the volume control. It's not reducing the volume control. It's also not producing that level of distortion, which I've found comes from an incorrect, let's say an incorrect relationship between the what's on one side of the output transformer and the other, what's called the reflected impedance back to the tubes. That if you can get that reflected impedance down to a certain point where the load lines of the tube itself begins to look like, almost a diode, it just doesn't have the headroom anymore to create this clean sound. So it starts to distort. Maybe I should do just a video on that at one point, but suffice it to say that it makes a lot of sense to me. After hearing, Don say that his amplifier was the quietest one that I've ever heard, that just reinforced that I was on the right track. And that was what was sort of going on. So yeah, maybe we'll do something this week, Arlen, on that so I could demonstrate to you. But if you look in my past sort of like video catalog, you'll find with the marshmallow, How Loud Is It? I think might be the name of the video. Let me just look real quick and see if I can find the exact title of this thing in my catalog of just rambling nonsense here, because there's so much of it. Let's see. For what not? Sonic signatures. Still looking. Okay. If you look at, it's called Brown Sound Level 2, How Loud Is It? That would be the exact video to look at, or you could hear me playing it in the room, the amplifier directly into speaker cabinets, and you could hear that it's not that quiet. It's not that loud, rather. Okay, so thanks for that, Arlen. We're going to look at that some more. Let's see. Sundance, good stuff. We're waiting for Don Landee. Absolutely. Geesbury, get in touch with Mark. They quasi invited you on Tone Talk. That's Dave Friedman, I think, right? Well, I'll have to look into that. Craig Cornell, man, that sounds good. Thank you, Craig. I think this was about the 50-watt Jose that I just finished doing. Let's see. All right, so here's some more other questions. Geesbury, Ozzy, do you know what Eddie did with his channel 2 on his Plexi? Did he jumper internally? Volume for that channel set to. I don't know. I wasn't there. And unless you were there that day to know what happened is, impossible. So I can only speculate. So I don't know. I've seen, pictures of other amplifiers that supposedly belong to Ed, that were later on in his lifetime where they did have, they were pretty much, stock, but they had, ability to jump the channels internally with a push-pull pot, like on the Jose's. So yeah, it could be that, that he did jumper them, but you got to go by your ears, I guess. Super Show on Triple X. Where do you get your transformers and chokes? I've always, for the past, I don't know, it's got to be with Three Monkeys. We used Hayboer. In Blockhead, I used a bunch of different people. I did use Hayboer in the Blockhead days, as well as some really esoteric winders. And for these, I've been using Hayboer, like the transformers that I designed to go in the Marshmallow, the one head here, I had built by Hayboer. I like what they do. And I have a good relationship with them, and I always feel great when I'm working with them. So it's, I like Hayboer. So that's pretty cool. I think someone had asked what pickup was in that Les Paul Sunburst, and it's a PAF. I can't remember who wound it, but it's a PAF type, like, an ordinary A2 kind of like deal. Oh yeah, here it is. It was Kevin Ellingham. What pickups are in the Les Paul? Yeah, they're just PAF of some sort. They might be from Mojo Tone, but the winder at the time, they're probably 10 or 12 years old. The winder at the time was Bartlett, and he used to work with Landee Fralin. So when I went down to Mojo, because I'm in North Carolina and they're down in North Carolina, and we used to go down there all the time and hang out a little bit. And when they were that's pretty, when they were starting up the winding room, they hired him, and he was doing, he brought in his equipment and he was winding pickups. So I asked him to wind me up some pickups. So I got a bunch of humbuckers from him at the time, and that was his version of the PAF, which I thought sounded really cool. So that was what was in that. So I think that's good for these questions. All right, we'll get out of there. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with trying to be as creative as possible when trying to figure out what these sounds are, right? So what we need to do is find ways of deriving those extra goodies, that ear candy, in creative ways from the original source sound. And that's, in the end, what's going to set you apart from everybody else in terms of creating sounds, is sort of like, a lot of people get all upset when you're chasing this sound. They say, why are you always chasing Eddie's sound? Why don't you work on your own sound? Well, guess what? All of this stuff is going to help you do that, right? Chasing this is going to open up an entire new world of possibilities to you. It's just the way it is. Like we talked about it being, like a yoga, right? Or something that allows you to explore the universe in terms of what's possible and what's not possible by trying to get someplace. So it's not so much the destination as it is the journey, right? For lack of a stupider cliche. I'm sure there's a stupider one, but not many. But the point being is that if you want to create your own sounds, you can start with the same equipment, but that doesn't mean you're going to sound the same, or should sound the same, or can sound the same, or have to sound the same. It's all in how you use it and how you put it all together, and observing things that you're like, oh, I like that, or I don't like that sound. Forget that. Let's try this. Oh, that's cool. This is cool. Put microphones. Hey, put a microphone anywhere. See what it does. Combine it. See what it does. Build a signal chain in a weird way. It's going to produce something, whether you find it, productive or enhancing or not, you're going to learn something. So I think that'll be it for today. We're going to continue on with, doing more playing and sound chasing and messing around and chasing our tail. But I think that'll do for Sundays today. So once again, I hope this was interesting, and thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.